Hello and welcome to this video on the neoliberal new right influence on social policy, feminism and gender regimes. When thinking about the influence of neoliberal and new right thought on social policy, it really kicks off in 1979, when Margaret Thatcher comes to power as the first female British Prime Minister at the head of a Conservative government. And their views were very different from the views that had preceded them from previous governments with regards to social policy on the family. So in many senses, we could say that this government was the key actor in promoting neoliberal and new right views. Thatcher, for example, banned the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. So, for example, homosexuality couldn't be taught as normative within education. She also defined divorce as a social problem and the cause of many social ills within society, and created the Child Support Agency, which would later become the Child Maintenance Service. However, she did also provide illegitimate children the same rights as those born in marriage. And by illegitimate children, we mean those born outside of marriage, and this was considered quite controversial by many of her neoliberal New Right allies. In 1997, the Conservative government left office and a new Labour government headed by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came to power. And they sought to respond to the neoliberal New Right's position of hegemony or hegemony, that is leadership or absolute control over the discourse and discussion around social policy on the family. Because by this point, neoliberal new right views were completely all powerful and most of society had accepted them as the normal way of doing things or of organising social policy. And so they attempted to fuse these more traditional neoliberal new right ideas on the family with what might be seen as more progressive ideas which are influenced by left-wing socialist or Marxist thought. There were a range of different policies that the new Labour government introduced, and it may be worth considering by pausing after each one of these which you consider to be progressive in terms of its viewpoint or more traditional in terms of its viewpoint. So, they promoted marriage by cutting some benefits for lone parents. They changed the law on adoption for cohabiting couples, including same-sex couples, so making it easier for those who are not married to adopt. They redistributed welfare benefits to focus on the poorest children in society, and benefits became means-tested rather than universal. That is to say, one had to prove that one truly needed them in order to receive these benefits. New Labour left office in 2010, and the coalition government, headed by the Conservatives, with support from the Liberal Democrats, came to power. This was an interesting time where these two parties struggled to find a consistent line between what one might consider modernisers in the New Labour trend and traditionalists in the more neoliberal New Right trend. However, one of the policies they did introduce was gay marriage, and it may be worth pausing once again and considering whether or not this is a progressive or traditional perspective and policy. That said, tax and benefits policies seemed to disproportionately hit two-parent families, and again, you may want to pause for a moment and consider, is that a more traditional or modern approach to policy making? The coalition government left office in 2015, and since then there have been two general elections. Currently, the Prime Minister is Theresa May, and many would argue that she continues in that vein of the neoliberal New Right approach to policy making. That said, it's still very early days for her government, and very little really has been achieved in the way of family policy or been put forward with a view to family policy, and this may be a product of the ongoing discussion around Brexit, which appears to be preoccupying much of the government's time. However, a policy paper has been published titled Improving Lives, Helping Workless Families, and again, you may want to consider what that title might be hinting at, and it is possible to do some short research online to discover what that policy paper is all about, but no new specific laws or pieces of legislation have been introduced as yet by this government. With regards to the feminist perspective on families and social policy, they argue that the state and its policies seek to maintain women's subordinate role in society and the unequal gender division of labour in the family. Most feminists would argue, in particular, neoliberal New Right policies on the family tend to hark back to a previous time where women were subordinated, less emancipated and less free more generally. Social policy often makes assumptions about what the normal family is, and it assumes the norm is a married couple with a male breadwinner and female homemaker. Taxes and benefits are organised around this assumption, and for feminists this is problematic because they would point to things like family diversity and the changing position of women in society and say, well, perhaps policy needs to reflect the changes that have taken place. This in particular makes life difficult for those in different familial setups. Feminists would point to a range of examples in order to underscore their points. So firstly, courts in the UK generally assume that women should have custody of children after divorce because it is assumed that women are going to be maternal and they're going to be homemakers and that children therefore would be best with mum. Although maternity leave is longer for women than men's paternity leave, this reinforces the idea that women are the primary caregivers for infants. So on the surface, whilst this seems as a positive thing, there does appear to be kind of a low-key issue here as well, as there is again an assumption that women should be the primary caregivers, although changes have been made in this area more recently. It can be difficult for married women to claim benefits, as it is assumed that they will be provided for by their husbands, and this may not be the case. We may have a situation, for example, where you have a married couple who are separated but not divorced, and the woman in this scenario may need to access benefits but may be prevented from doing so as a result of this assumption. In terms of criticisms of the feminist perspective, well, not all policies are directly aimed at maintaining patriarchy. In the UK alone, we can point to things such as the Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, gay marriage, benefits for lone parents, refuges for women escaping domestic violence, and equal rights to divorce as examples of where changes have been made, and actually not all policy is primarily aimed at maintaining male dominance within society. They have been challenged by these sorts of policies. Moreover, the position of women in society has undoubtedly improved in recent times, and one would mostly argue that's an objective truth. However, of course, more still needs to be done, and there is still much more in particular needs to be done with the things such as the Equal Pay Act. Although that's been around for quite a while now, we still find there is a big pay gap between men and women, narrowing but still in existence. As we know, feminists argue that social policy reinforces the patriarchal family. Eileen Drew uses the concept of gender regimes to describe how social policies in different countries can either encourage or discourage gender equality. And she identifies two different types of family policies, which, as again, she refers to as gender regimes. The first type of gender regime Drew identifies is familistic gender regimes. This is where a country bases their family policies on the assumption that the majority of its families are headed by a male breadwinner who supports the family whilst the wife stays at home and is responsible for domestic tasks and child rearing. It's this very traditional view. So for example, Greece does not publicly fund childcare, so mothers stay at home to care for their kids. The second type of gender regime that Drew identifies are individualistic gender regimes. So, these base their policies on the belief that husbands and wives should be treated equally. Wives are not assumed to be financially dependent on their husbands. Each partner has an equal entitlement to state benefits. Drew argues that most EU countries are moving today towards individualistic gender regimes. And I think we could probably say that's what we're seeing in the UK today. However, policies such as publicly funded childcare are not cheap. They involve major conflicts about who should benefit from social policies and who should pay for them. And this is very much a political discussion between, on one hand, a more neoliberal new right perspective, very traditional, and on the other hand, a more progressive modernist perspective, which is challenging those traditional ideas. It would be naive to assume that there is an inevitable march of progress view towards gender equality. Things aren't always getting better. Sometimes it can be a case of one step forward, two steps back. Nevertheless, the differences between European countries show that social policies play an important role in promoting or preventing gender equality within the family. That's it. Thank you very much.